Good morning and welcome to the Wonder Box. What could possibly be in our box today? Let's see. A seed. I met a seed once. He was one bad seed. He's a veteran of the great seed drop. I met him in the book written by Jory John and that I've adapted to share with you today for Veterans Day. Here is his story in his own words. I'm a bad seed. A bad seed. Oh yeah, it's true. The other seeds, they look at me and they say that seed is so bad. When they think I'm not listening, they mumble, there goes that bad seed. But I can hear them. I have good hearing for a seed. How bad am I? Do you really want to know? Well, I never put things back where they belong. I'm late to everything. I tell long jokes with no punchline. Oh yeah. I never wash my hands or my feet. I lie about pointless stuff. I cut in line every time. I stare everybody down. And I glare at everybody who passes. I finish everybody's sentences and I never listen. And I do a lot of other bad things too. You know why? 'Cause I'm a bad seed. I just can't help it. Sure, I wasn't always this bad. I was born a humble seed on a simple sunflower in an unremarkable field. I had a big family, seeds everywhere. We found ways of having fun like you wouldn't believe. We were so close. Then the petals dropped and our flower drooped. And it's all kind of a blur. I remember a bag and everything went dark. And then a giant tried to destroy me. I thought I was a goner. I thought I was done for. I screamed and I hollered, ah! But I was spit out at the last possible second. I flew through the air and I landed under the bleachers with a huge thud. When I woke up, it was dark outside. A wad of gum had softened my fall. I felt okay. And I looked okay. But something had changed inside of me. I'd become a different seed entirely. I started thinking of myself as a bad seed, and because of that, others began to see me and judge me as a bad seed. That's right. I stopped smiling. I kept to myself. I drifted. I was a friend to nobody and I was lost on purpose. I lived in a soda can and I didn't care. It suited me. Till recently, that is. Even though I'm a bad seed, I have friends who just kept treating me with kindness, even though they don't know about the things I've gone through. They don't judge me. They love me. I'm working on my attitude, not to be a bad seed anymore. I'm ready to be happy. It's hard to be good when you're so used to being thought of as bad. But I'm trying, taking it one day at a time. Sure, I still forget to listen, and I still show up late, and I still talk during movies. And I do all sorts of other bad stuff. But I also say thank you, and I say please, and I smile. And I hold doors open for people. Not always, but sometimes. And even though I still feel bad sometimes, I also feel kind of good. Sort of a mix. All I can do is keep trying and keep thinking, maybe I'm not such a bad seed after all. I wonder, have you ever met someone like the bad seed? Have you ever negatively judged someone like the bad seed? Do you think someone may have judged you negatively when you were just really having a bad day? And I wonder, what could happen if instead of forming an opinion of someone based on judging them, we were to instead embrace them in curiosity and love? Our faith calls us to love and kindness. And with this, our story is told. Until the next time.
Jennifer Bacmeister has been a member of this church since 2001. She has served this church in a variety of capacities, including as vice president, religious educator, head of the worship committee, and our building task force. Jennifer, welcome.
Oh my goodness, it's so good to be back, isn't it? I was so excited. Last week I had a new dress. I put on pantyhose. And I went out to my car and I had a tire so flat it was down to the rim. So I am so glad to be here today with a round tire. It feels like the Tin Man. I feel like I have done this for so long and then I didn't get to do it for so long. The patterns are familiar, but I'm rusty. So it's good to see everybody. I'm so glad to be back. Part of that rustiness is I failed to give Elizabeth enough information about me, to give to you, to give you some information on this sermon this morning. I actually retired from the Army in 2006. I joined the military right out of high school. I was an Army bandsman. I was a flute and piccolo player. For about half my career, I then spent the other half in either the reserves and then the National Guard. I was stationed with the National Guard in South Georgia at Fort Stewart, just outside Savannah, when 9/11 happened. And we thought we were safe because we were a little unit in South Georgia, and we were assigned to other units across the state of Georgia and deployed to Iraq in 2003 and was gone for a year. And shortly after I got back, the military decided, I don't need you anymore. And they medically retired me, although I was right at 20 years of service. So that probably would have been helpful for me to give to Elizabeth in my introduction on that. This is a topic I've been thinking about for a long time. I've been home for a long time, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for the support that this congregation gave me while I was gone and my family while I was gone. I had I don't even want to admit how old he was then, a child at home who received a great deal of love and support. And that really informed the information I want to share with you today. So a week ago, I was standing in line at Walgreens at the pharmacy window, 6 feet away from the person in front of me. And it was this woman, and she was doing her best to wrangle this child, probably 6 years old, who wanted to go touch the stuff and pick up a candy bar. And she's trying to hold him close while she's picking up a prescription. And I heard the clerk ask her for a birthday. And she said something 1980. And I thought, oh, she's picking something up for her child. Until I did the math in my head and realized two things. That prescription was for her son. Oh no, the prescription was for her, not for her son. And I'm old. Because I remember 1980. And it was not like right when I was born. On September 11th, 2001, a series of 4 coordinated terrorist attacks were carried out by the militant Islamic terrorist group, Al-Qaeda. That morning, 4 commercial airliners were each hijacked mid-flight by groups of Al-Qaeda terrorists. Each group had one person with flight training who took over that flight. And their explicit goal was to crash each plane into a prominent American building, causing mass casualties and either partial or complete destruction of the building. 2 of the planes hit the Twin Towers in the World Trade Center in New York, and a 3rd hit the west side of the Pentagon. A 4th plane was intended to crash into a target near Washington, D.C., but instead crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, following a good old American revolt. These attacks resulted in almost 3,000 fatalities, 25,000 injuries, substantial long-term health consequences, and at least $10 billion in infrastructure and property damage. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in human history and the single deadliest incident for firefighters and law enforcement in the history of the United States. There are many people today, like that nice woman in line at Walgreens, who were mere children when this happened. And that's why I share that with you this morning. Many of us can say, it's like when John Lennon was shot, where were you when the towers were struck? But many of us don't remember it that way. So sometimes when you're old, like me, you have to remember that not everyone knows what you know, and a bit of history, or what the kids on Instagram call backstory, is helpful. So I offer that remembrance as a remembrance, but also as history and part of our backstory. On December 9th of 2001, I was the guest speaker at BBUUS. We were a society then, not a church, so BBUS is not a typo. The title of my address was Might Makes Right, Faith on the Battlefield and on the Home Front. I was invited to share my perspective of both being a UU and an active enlisted member in the military, especially in light of the 9/11 attacks. And I focused that sermon on how I balanced my commitment to defend this country at all costs while remaining true to my UU values. But in 2001, I had not been deployed to Iraq yet. And like I said, as a member of a tiny National Guard unit, we weren't actually a unit, we were a detachment. We were only about 28 people. Deployment and actual war wasn't even on my radar. I've learned a lot since then. One of those being that faith, that might makes right, faith on the battlefield and the home front, is way too long a title for anybody's sermon. But one of the effects of actually experiencing war is I now see the world through a different lens. And what I see is that we're surrounded by remnants of war, and that we've immersed our culture in the glorification of the warrior. And as dire as that sounds, it's not actually new. Paintings and mosaics from ancient Greece depict the favored sons going off to battle and returning to celebration and adulation. The first known depiction of a handshake comes from a 5th century Greek mosaic. The gesture was originally intended to show the person that you're meeting that your fighting hand, generally your right hand, was unarmed. You had nothing up your sleeve, so to speak. A handshake was proof you were willing, at least initially, to discuss the matter at hand and not fight about it. 2 years ago, when we used to shake hands, y'all remember that? We didn't need confirmation that Bob from accounting wasn't going to stab us in the break room, but the gesture still persists. It's a very old ghost from very old wars. The adoption of military ways and means into daily civilian life has only increased. Some of this intertwining comes hand in hand with advanced technology. The telegraph was invented in 1837. Okay, so I'm going backwards, but you got to advance with me. One of the first extremely efficient mechanical printing presses became available readily in 1847. And with the combination of the two, the newspaper industry had exploded in the United States just ahead of the Civil War. By 1860, the United States had almost 2,500 publications, most of them daily or weekly. Widespread use of the telegraph meant that war-related news reached Americans across the country in both rural and urban areas at unprecedented speeds. Because of that technology, the Civil War would become the most well-reported conflict in history. Reporters traveling with the armies sent dispatches directly from the field, and many soldiers wrote letters home that were published in their local newspapers. These first-hand narratives delivered to the populace at what was close to real time as the world had ever seen laid groundwork for what would become full-blown hero worship in subsequent years. In a similar pattern, the embedded reporter and technology, this time the television, brought the violence of the Vietnam War right into our living rooms. Instead of black and white sketches and printed narrative, we had newsreels with footage of bombings, destroyed buildings, and injured soldiers and civilians. The political divisiveness of the war put protesters in the public eye as well. Protest songs are still written today and owe a great cultural debt to the protesters of the Vietnam War. And as much as culture affects how we perceive war and those who fight them, war seeps back into our culture and continues to affect us. As the first Gulf War began, there were well-documented decisions by political leaders as to how to portray the war. An article from the Salon website, written by Charles Ponce de Leon, speaks to these events. It was no accident that the war in Iraq was the quintessential television event. Months before the invasion even began, the Bush administration and military officials began planning how they would convey it to the American public in the new age of around-the-clock media coverage. They were determined to control the story and encourage media identification with the US-led campaign. And they recognized the enormous news hole that the cable channels in particular needed to fill, and it required a constant stream of new information. Severely limiting media access, as the military had done in Afghanistan, was unlikely to produce news to fill this hole and could inspire independent journalistic inquiry or provide a forum for naysayers. No. Accordingly, they settled on a more open and seemingly transparent approach, turning Operation Iraqi Freedom into an extravagant and compelling reality TV show. Instead of the usual bare and colorless rooms where military officials issued briefings to reporters and television cameras, they actually had Hollywood producers create a more visually arresting set, something like you might see on Survivor. And they supplemented the official military-produced films of airstrikes, which was a staple of television war coverage since the Persian Gulf War, so we were used to that. It wasn't interesting anymore, with a more intimate, ground-level view of the conflict by allowing several hundred credentialed and specially trained reporters, including veterans like Ted Koppel, to accompany American and British troops as embedded correspondents. But even the twisted depiction of the Gulf War was not new. Government-produced media with the purpose of swaying public opinion, which is just a fancy way to describe propaganda, was a vital part of the war effort in World War II. And some of this stuff seems really innocuous to us now. There was an article published by the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which I didn't even know was there. They wrote an article about the wartime use of popular media, and they said, President Franklin Roosevelt's administration recognized the powerful influence of the entertainment industry early on and looked for ways to harness that energy. The Office of War Information was the main arbiter of this relationship, and they worked with film studios, screenwriters, radio stations, newspapers, cartoonists, and artists across the United States to produce films, posters, songs, and radio broadcasts, urging everyday Americans to cooperate with the government's wartime programs and restrictions. Even though much of this work was essentially propaganda, some of it became very popular. In 1942, for example, the War Department asked the Writers' War Board to come up with material to help recruit volunteers for the Army Air Forces beyond just pilots. The board's creative artists responded with 52 nonfiction articles, 12 stories, a novel, and even a song called I Want to Marry a Bombardier. The resulting surge of bombardier recruits was so large the War Department had to ask the writers to suspend their campaign. That's a lot of bombardiers. By the time victory was declared in 1945, a whole new world of war-related sights and sounds had become part of America's popular culture, some intended purely for entertainment and some as propaganda. This close relationship of culture supporting war and war supporting our culture continues today. We don't see Rosie the Riveter posters or hear the Andrews sisters toasting the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, but instead, we have movies based on real war stories and real warriors. Black Hawk Down, Hurt Locker, Saving Private Ryan, Platoon. When I went to basic training in the Army, I got there in the summertime. And because of a lot of high school students, they'll spend all summer goofing off, and then they'll report to basic in the fall when they're friends and they'll go to college. I, of course, being the overachiever, showed up in June. And they didn't have enough women to form a unit, so we just kind of hung out in a group. They kind of marched us around, and we picked rocks out of the grass and learned how to iron our uniforms, but it wasn't really basic training until they had enough bodies to form a whole company as people came in to the processing station. So the last night that we're in this processing unit, before we actually get our gear together and leave to do real basic training, they marched us over to the base theater for what was fondly known as mandatory fun, and they showed us the movie Platoon. I never thought I would see an entire theater full of teenage girls screaming to go home. I have to wonder who chose that movie as the one to show everybody the night before we actually left for basic training. It was probably just the popular movie of the time, and nobody put any thought into it. On top of all that, we have realistic video games now, like Call of Duty. I can't even watch people play Call of Duty. You can actually go on the internet. I did not know this till I started researching for this sermon. You can find lists where people like historians have evaluated video games based on war themes and how accurate they are for terrain, for type of combat, for the weapons choices and all these things. So you can go to the internet and say, I would really like a video game that makes me feel like I'm in World War II, and there's a list. Not sure that's the upside of the internet. But unfortunately, it's this kind of after-the-fact storytelling that leads us to glorify the warrior. The narratives of the Civil War were used mostly to inform friends and family back home. The blatant propaganda of World War II does exist. It's in museums. You can go see it. And the other media that still exists have been turned into cultural icons, and they're adapted to fit our current agenda. Rosie the Riveter, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, has been appropriated for any number of causes that call for people to come together and work against a common enemy, although originally it was a call to celebrate the women who put the rivets in the bomb planes. I actually have a poster that used to be in my office back when I had an office, and it's Leela from Futurama, the cartoon, and she's in the same pose with her head wrap on and her purple ponytail, and she's got the slacker attitude and says, if we have to, instead of we can do it. How many people don't know the origin of that icon? Because it's everywhere now. Casablanca was World War II and was issued as a way to rally American support, but it's just an old movie now. I don't think anybody is actually striving to buy a bar in Morocco and provide cover to people escaping from the Nazis. Maybe I need to start that. Do movies and entertainment like Black Hawk Down and video games like Call of Duty actually make people want to become helicopter pilots and infantrymen? Maybe. Enlistment in the Navy actually spiked when Top Gun was released. Did most of those people who enlisted get to be pilots? Nope. And it's not unheard of now for the military to set recruiters up in movie theaters when shows like Hurt Locker premiere, because everybody wants to be a hero after they see it on the screen. But the biggest failing of this current warrior idolatry is how military valor is exemplified, and that's good, but it does not consider the true cost of war. Some of these movies do a good job of showing you the after effect, but again, this is entertainment in Hollywood that is intentionally manipulating your feelings about this subject, but they're encouraging us to send our sons and daughters off to combat because Hurt Locker looks cool. They're heroes. It's okay if they have a shit life when they get back and they're crazy, because look at the great things that they did. Will this fade with time? Will the movie Platoon be our generation's Gone with the Wind in 100 years? We can only hope. Our culture is saturated with these combat references. And as the world becomes smaller because of technology and the spread of refugees from war continues across the globe, this aggressiveness doesn't feel like it's abating. And my concern was, as you use, do we know how to navigate this world and stay true to our values? Do we actually have the resources to push towards peace? In 2006, the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association posed this question for congregations to consider over the subsequent years. And the question was, should the Unitarian Universalist Association reject the use of any and all kinds of violence and war to resolve disputes between peoples and nations, and adopt a principle of seeking just peace through nonviolent means? That's why you get a couple years to think about that question. If you aren't familiar with General Assembly or the process to create what's called a statement of conscience, you should look into it. That's probably a whole nother sermon or a whole nother topic for a different day, but it's a fascinating look at how the democracy works within our own faith. And after UU congregations participated in the multi-year process of discernment over this question, the answer was presented as a statement of conscience, which was then adopted at GA in 2010. The statement is 575 words long. It's really, really long, and I just want to hit the highlights here. We believe all people share a moral responsibility to create peace. Our commitment to creating peace calls us to the work of peace building, peacemaking, and peacekeeping. We advocate a culture of peace through a transformation of public policies, religious consciousness, and individual lifestyles. We agree that our initial response to conflict should be the use of nonviolent methods. We repudiate aggressive and preventive wars, the disproportionate use of force, covert wars, and targeting that includes a high risk to civilians. Our faith calls us to create peace, yet we profess that we have not done all we could do to prevent the spread of armed conflict throughout the world. As a faith, we can return to this statement to help guide our actions. Within our congregations, we can tap those resources offered to us by our regional and national leadership. But more than that, I want to leave you this morning with useful actions you can take at that individual level. First, get busy with your free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Learn about the concepts of pacifism, peacemaking, and just war theory, and I walked into this thinking, I know what all that stuff is. I was wrong. There's so much out there. They may seem like very different ideas, but all three of them are considered anti-war. Simply put, pacifism is a belief that any violence, including war, is unjustifiable under any circumstances, and that all disputes should be settled by peaceful means. However, there are several subtypes of pacifism that are way too in-depth to go to this morning. But until I started trying to educate myself about that, I didn't know. Peacemaking is defined as a transition from a state of war to a state of peace by deliberate action of the parties involved. And that means on both sides. Peacemaking generally includes measures to address conflicts in progress and involves diplomatic action. And in the same way that pacifism exists in several forms, peacemaking has several different schools of thought. But it's still an anti-war effort. And just theory, which is the one I heard about most of when I was in the military, the just war theory specifies conditions for judging if it is good to go to war, and if you go to war, what are the conditions on how you fight? The Geneva Convention rules, many of you are probably familiar with it. We're not supposed to abuse the enemy combatants that we seize. Those are just war considerations under the just war theory. Usually the conditions are divided into two groups. One of them is the conditions that must be met before you go to war, and then there's the second set of conditions about how you act during war. You're probably familiar with this without knowing it's actually a theory, and you can take courses on it online. But once you know what kind of anti-war person you are you a pacifist? Do you believe in just war? You will have the first arrow in your quiver to find like-minded people and to understand others who are not so like-minded. And we are so wrapped up in the culture. How many of you just caught that an arrow in your quiver is a military metaphor? Oops. I didn't catch it when I wrote it. It's that kind of embeddedness that we are trying to become conscious of. Second thing you can do, become politically active. The fifth principle, the right of conscience and the use of democratic process within our congregations, and most importantly, society at large. Honestly, for all of you who have been at a committee meeting or annual meeting here or at GA, we got the process down. It's not slow, but it works. So focus your efforts on that society at large. If you are against a world with war in it, help put the people in leadership positions that feel the same way. You don't have to run for office or write a fat check. Do what you can do. Stick a stamp, wave a sign, because every little bit helps. It moves us towards that sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And the third thing you can do is treat everyone with kindness. It is the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of all people, and a little bit of that second principle, which is compassion in relationships. And it's so trite, isn't it? Haven't we heard this a million times, at least, probably in the last 2 weeks? But it's true. We don't know what battles people are fighting, literally or figuratively. It can be hard to be kind, though, because we are constantly barraged with these images of violence and told that we need to be dominant, we need to be the hero, and you can't have a hero unless somebody else is vanquished. And we don't tend to be kind to the vanquished because we other them. That's them, but we're good. Woo! It takes active practice to get good at kindness. And one of my favorite exercises, maybe you can try this on the way home if you had a journey across the Bacmeister Bridge like I did this morning, is when you see someone in traffic acting badly. And a lot of us are not in traffic as much as we used to be, but it's probably one of the primary activities where you still have some interaction with other folks these days. Perhaps these folks are speeding, weaving through traffic, they're driving too slow and they're in your way, or you get by them and you see they're wrapped up on their phone and they're driving erratically. Take a deep breath and think about what would be happening in your life that would make you act that way. And give the other driver, the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they're a new driver. Maybe they're super nervous and this is the second time they've ever been on the highway without their mom in the seat next to them and they're going slow so they don't make a mistake. Maybe they just got bad news and they're trying to keep it all together until they get home. I have gotten into the habit of saying to cars that speed recklessly past me is, instead of going, "Oh, you big jerk, you scared me, you almost cut me off," I've rephrased that to, "I hope you get where you're going okay. I hope you arrive at your destination safely. Now, these people can't hear me. I don't even have to say it out loud. But it's better for my blood pressure. It lets me practice kindness and compassion in a way that is error-free. I can't do it wrong. And if you do a little bit every day, if you're kind and compassionate to people who aren't returning the favor, there's no expectation there. You get better at it when you're face-to-face with the idiot clerk who can't see to ring your produce up right. Because maybe she's just having a bad day too. At the end of the day, it can be very difficult to reconcile our desire for peace when we are surrounded by those who glorify combat and violence. And at times, like I just did with quivers and arrows, we may even find ourselves echoing war cries that are so embedded in our culture we don't even realize that we're doing it. But we have the tools to create a different world. I have you, and you have me, and we can wage peace within ourselves, within our church, and outwards towards the community around us, and ultimately, that touches the whole world. The Chinese philosopher Deng Mindao said, "The peace of one individual is small. The peace of many people together is big." When we see ourselves as separate from each other, from our community, and from nature, then violence and strife arise. It is only when we understand our part in an overall unity that there is the possibility of peace on a large scale. Thank you.